Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our seventh class in the 2020 Manitoba ASALH Summer Lecture Series. We're going to start our class a bit differently this morning. You all are aware that we lost a hero late yesterday, I believe. John Lewis died, and I know, like myself, you have all been grieving, but also reflecting on the truly remarkable life that this man led. I've just got a couple of photos to help us think about John Lewis, how appropriate that we are in this section of our Reconstruction class focusing on Black political leadership during Reconstruction. And of course, he, I believe, was a congressman for 14 or 15 terms, remarkable years, and obviously has had an impact long before elected to Congress. I shared this one early photo of a very young John Lewis in the company of giants, and I don't know his exact age, but he was generations younger than most of the gentlemen here. So John Lewis at this point was the chair of the Southern of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I believe he served in that role between 1963 to 66. So that gives us some time frame. To his left is Whitney Young, who at that point was the national director of the Urban League. A. Philip Randolph to his left, president of the American Labor Council. Martin Luther King Jr., then president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. James Farmer to Dr. King's left, the director of CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality. Roy Wilkins, the executive secretary at that time of the NAACP. So certainly in the company of giants, and what great respect that these gentlemen would embrace someone who they obviously saw as hugely important to the movement because he represented the thousands of young people who were manning lunch counters and manning buses and being beaten in marches. And so it's, again, quite an enormous legacy. Later in life, obviously, a very important mentor to President Obama. Here we see Obama awarding him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And a wave goodbye. So I'm going to leave this part now before Peter up because he is a hero of just importance to all of us. My wife and I had the great fortune to meet him July of, I think, 2018 at the Atlanta airport. I, of course, was not going to chase the man down in the runway, but you know my wife, she did. And I'm glad she did, because we will have this memory always. Again, John Lewis, a great leader. Okay, let's get into the class today. Thank you for giving me those couple of minutes in memoriam. I wanted to start a little differently, as I said. I'm going to ask Judge Larry Lawson if he would just if he'd unmute himself and take just a couple of minutes and update us on this Florida voting case. Very important. Again, as we're talking about Reconstruction, the 15th Amendment, you remember we said that the Congress at the time, the Republican Congress, had the option to create an amendment providing an affirmative right that you as a have a right, but instead they opted for the 15th Amendment, which simply provides a way to redress inhibitions or actions taken against voting, and partly explain why we have such a difficult time today why we had to have a Voting Rights Act 1965. But let me be quiet and let Larry, if you're unmuted, just update the class, Larry, on where we are with this important case.
Fine. Thank you very much, David. As you know, this week, the court, the United States Supreme Court, denied hearing a removal of an injunction or a stay that had been placed by the 11th Circuit. The Constitution was amended. However, the legislature and the governor decided that they were going to add a provision to what the voters had done in 2018 and say that all fines, penalties, and restitutions had to be paid. The problem with that was that it goes back to what we were discussing about having different conditions placed on voting. And what was done was that there was a challenge to that because a lot of people did not know the fines, penalties, or restitutions that was owed. And this was a violation of equal protection, the indigency clause, due process, and the 24th Amendment, because in essence, it amounted to a tax. The court entered a preliminary injunction would say, well, you know, we wanted to take a look at it. And then Judge Hinkle in the district court had a 8-day hearing where he found that the provision that the legislature and the governor had enacted was unconstitutional because there was no rhyme or basis for it. There was no rational basis for it. And in fact, found out that it was a tax in essence, that there was no due process because one could not find out how much they owed because the Florida records were so in disarray that it will take until 2026 until someone found out how much they really owed. And also that based upon the indigency, it was a wealth tax, which means that if you were a felon and was released from prison and you were able to pay your fines, you could vote. However, if you were a person who was indigent, you could not vote. Therefore, in a 125-page opinion, Judge Hinkle rendered his decision. This was done in May 2020 this year. It wasn't until July 1 that the 11th Circuit put in a stay. And they stayed for no reason Judge Hinkle's decision. Judge Hinkle then asked for them to get an advisory opinion. They did, and again, he vacated the injunction. And again, the 11th Circuit imposed an injunction enjoining it without making any findings of facts or any conclusions at all to upset what Judge Hinkle had found was illegal and violative of the Constitution. The matter went to Supreme Court Justice Thomas, and of course he did nothing, giving it to the full court. The full court did nothing to remove the stay, and now the matter is back before the 11th Circuit to discuss the permanent injunction. However, that is August 18th. August 18th happens to be the day of the primary. July 20th, Monday, is the last day to register. These individuals can't register because there's an onus placed on the affirmation for becoming eligible to vote, that if you vote, if you fill out the form and you are not truthful, that's another felony. So these people are somewhat in a quagmire. So as you can see, what we thought we had accomplished in getting away from different restrictions being placed, they're right back, and the court has done it in this case on their own.
Thank you, Larry. I appreciate that. And we'll talk more, find a way to talk more about what we as citizens, voters, Americans can do. I just take you back one moment to the Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder case 2013. This was the U.S. Supreme Court removing the pre-clearance conditions imposed upon several southern states. Pre-clearance meaning before they could make any changes to their voting practices, they'd have to get clearance from the Justice Department. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court in Holder said, we're at a point in time where that's no longer necessary. The Voting Rights Act was put in place when Jim Crow was at its height, and Black men and women were being actively prevented from voting. We're beyond that now, the court, and I'm paraphrasing obviously. So they took away those pre-clearance requirements, and almost immediately, all of the same southern states subject to those pre-clearances began putting in place voter suppression activities like voter ID and closing down voter polls. I mean, it's incredible, but we do need to understand how this Supreme Court, how the Republican Party in most cases has acted to essentially take away again the voting rights of Black and poor and people of color in this country. Getting off the soapbox, let me get back to the class, but I did want us to take a few minutes and reflect and give some thought. How can we cause some good trouble, as John Lewis has directed us to. Okay, so class summary last week, we began our discussion, continued our discussion on Black political leadership. We're going to conclude that today. I want to talk about two particular heroes of mine from this era, like Robert Smalls. We talked about and showed the visual of the 1868 Constitutional Convention and the 1868 South Carolina legislature. Remember, at all times, these conventions were established where men, white men, Black men, would go and put forward proposals to create a new constitution. It happened under the Johnson government, obviously not very effectively at all, which is why the radical Republicans then had to come in, create a new, under the Reconstruction Acts, a new format, and you had these conventions again convene, and at these conventions they created conventions and constitutions that would remain in place up until the end of the 19th century. Also last week, you remember we had the wonderful interview with Michael Bulwer Moore, and again I thank him for sharing his reflections and knowledge of Robert Smalls during this time. Okay, so for today, we again are going to look at a couple of key heroes, Robert Brown Elliott and John Roy Lynch. Stories that in their own way are as compelling and as interesting as Robert Smalls is. So I want to take some time and introduce you to these two gentlemen. We're going to begin looking at the violence and backlash. We've talked about violence throughout these 6, now 7 classes because it was simply a fact of life for freed men, women, and children. Violence was a part of the enslaved person's lives for the hundreds of years prior to Reconstruction. It was maybe more magnified because, as you remember, we said an enslaver had a financial investment in his enslaved person. That did not keep the enslaver from whipping and punishing, imposing discipline, but they would stop short of losing that asset, of killing that asset. That obviously falls away as the 13th Amendment, as freedom comes. And what you then find is that impulse to punish completely unfettered. And so we've tried to point out in all of the previous classes how violence played a horrible part of the lives of people during Reconstruction. It now will be magnified through the end of Reconstruction as the white Redeemer governments, the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the White Camellia, the Red Shirts, all of these Klan-like groups emerge to work together with the Democrats, the Democratic Party, to take back the South. Next week, we will end. Obviously, we will look at the end of Reconstruction. We'll look at the legacy of Reconstruction, and we will try to make some sense out of this, again, 15 to 12 year period of time, which was America's best and greatest opportunity to be true to itself, but it failed. And we, again, live with that failure today in things like the right to vote. Why, after these many years and after a constitution that clearly should have clearly established that right, or all of these rights, do we still struggle with these same issues? So let me move on. I'd like to take a short bit again from Henry Louis Gates's Reconstruction. He does a nice job in kind of continuing the dialogue around this really important part of Reconstruction. Let me get to the right spot. That's not the right spot.
American members were here, there would have been
enormous strides and wrenching retreats. Early on, in its most hopeful moments, it seemed like a revolution was taking place in the halls of Congress.
Tell me about where we're standing. What would this place have been like during Reconstruction?
So this is the old hall, the House, now Statuary Hall. In the 1870s, when the African American members were here, there would have been vendors in here selling food and snacks as members traversed the north-south access from the House chamber over to the rotunda on the Senate side.
Tell me about the first black congressman.
First is Hiram Revels from Mississippi, is elected to the U.S. Senate, and he comes in February of 1870, and he's celebrated as the 15th Amendment in flesh and blood, the symbolic triumph of Reconstruction. And then in December, we have Joseph Rainey of South Carolina, first African American in the House.
How would they have been greeted?
They didn't exactly roll out the red carpet, but the door didn't get shut either. Many of the African American members lived in the same neighborhoods that white members of Congress did. So they weren't segregated in that sense, but they oftentimes had to pay higher rents.
It's a black tax.
Essentially, yes. Yeah. Imagine you have these two men who occupy the seats of former slaveholders, and they come to work in this magnificent Temple of Liberty, but it's a place that had also been constructed with slave labor.
This is an incredibly heady moment, kind of like Barack Obama becoming president. There's like 14 black men in U.S. Congress. There's 2 senators. Blanche K. Bruce's name is on money. He's signing currency in the United States.
See, all of these people served starting in the 1870s. I may be the only African-American from South Carolina now, but I am the 9th. You had the Robert Smalls, Richard Keynes, Robert Elliott, DeLarge, Rancia. So over that period of 25 years, you had real participatory democracy taking place.
The photograph of Hiram Revels highlights this statesman who happens to be African American. Frederick Douglass recognized a camera captured the equal and essential humanity of that man or woman, black or white.
Whatever may be the prejudices of those who look upon it, they will be compelled to admit that the Mississippi senator is a man.
He is represented with the same stature as Lincoln or Seward or Grant or any other white politician. Douglass did the same thing. at a time in which most whites tried to argue that blacks should not have equal citizenship. And one way of out-citizening white citizens is you portray yourself with greater sense of dignity and respectability, and in a sense humanity, than many whites.
We do not come here begging for our rights. We come here clothed in the garb of American citizenship. We come demanding our rights in the name of justice.
Richard Kane could capture an audience. I think all his years in the pulpit made him a really good speaker in the House. He stood up to the white supremacists who were basically calling him, inferior. And he said, look at me, I have 2 eyes, I have 2 ears, I have 2 hands, I have 2 feet. How are we different when it comes to our manhood?
I was amazed when I began to read the speeches of Black congressmen in that period. I mean, here are people who are arguing about what the laws of the nation will provide in terms of human rights, and have a sophisticated understanding of the underlying principles that make these freedoms necessary in a democratic society. The level of discourse was so far above the level of discourse in Congress today. It was shocking.
In state houses across the South, black men and white men were attempting to govern together for the first time. In South Carolina, where African Americans made up almost 60% of the population, voters elected a black majority House of Representatives.
It was the seat of Black Power USA. The Lieutenant Governor, Secretary of State, State Treasurer.
Unimaginable today.
Absolutely.
Many parts of the South didn't have a educated and experienced black leadership ready to step into power, which you did have in South Carolina. It had a free black group before the Civil War in Charleston, which was well educated and politically articulate.
Behind us lie 243 years of suffering, anguish, and degradation. Before us lies our mighty future. That future is ours to shape.
Robert Brown Elliott was very ambitious. He was educated as a lawyer. He had a photographic memory. He was absolutely fearless.
It's hard to imagine more daunting challenges than all these governments have. Some parts of the South had really been devastated by war. So you've got to try to build a forward-looking government at a time where there are very few resources.
The state legislatures create public schools, public hospitals, public welfare systems in a way that hadn't been seen in the South.
Black men go into these legislatures with an idea of how they're going to improve their communities. One of the most important things they do is to establish free public schools.
There were no public education systems in most of the southern states. If you had money to buy it for your children, you had it. If you didn't, well, you did without.
You start to see state constitutions adopting some policy that says education is a right. And this is providing it for all children.
Across the former Confederacy, free schools opened for both black and white children. Only a few years earlier, there were laws on the books in the South that prohibited enslaved people from learning to read and write.
Black people knew how much their freedom depended upon literacy. It was not uncommon to see 5-year-olds and 95-year-olds flocking to schoolhouses for a chance to learn how to read.
Free blacks realized white families are not going to send their kids to school with blacks. And so in every single state, you had the separate schools. And black leaders generally said, that's okay. As long as black people get education, we're not going to try to force whites to go to school where they don't want to. And many black parents wanted black teachers. They didn't trust white teachers to be fair and to have the right attitudes for their children.
To meet this demand for teachers, governments, black churches, and missionary organizations established black colleges and universities. Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee
was founded in 1866.
Let my people into this phrase. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt's land.
The Fisk Jubilee Singers became the voice of Black Reconstruction. They introduced the world to the artistry of freed people and to the songs of their enslaved ancestors.
Lois would tell me to not stop that at that point and let it go, but we better get back to the class. It is a wonderful piece. I want to go back to, so two things, the imagery, Hiram Revels and Frederick Douglass. Nobody captures the importance of this process better than Henry Louis Gates in his Stony the Road. We don't have time in this class, and really what he gets into the sort of the Jim Crow era and this combat that is done by people like Douglass, and Du Bois will join in that in the early part of the 20th century to combat this racist imagery, the minstrelsy. And so Douglass, I think, was reported to be the most photographed man in the world. And that was explicit. That was very, very strategic. And that point was brought out. The other thing, and I've said this before, had these legislators, and I have to be careful not to simply say Black legislators, because as Fauner reminded us last week, these were still majority white institutions. They have a larger number of Black members than ever, and even today, obviously. But the creation of free public schools, where none had previously existed, in my mind, is sufficient, more than sufficient, to say this was an important era in American history, to say that this was a huge accomplishment. And if you question that, we will see when we look at violence and backlash in our next segment, what would the Klan burn first? What institutions would they burn? The schools. They'll burn the churches, certainly, and that continues through today. But that, again, was a part of the racist, white supremacist plan to subjugate, again, Black men, women, and children. Let me move on. Okay, so I used this slide last week. I'm not going to review it again, but I did miss one important point. Du Bois, in his Black Reconstruction, talks about the constitutions that were created in all of these reconstructed, Republican reconstructed states. Let me just read what he said about the Constitution in South Carolina. He said, the Constitution was written in good English and was an excellent document, embodying some of the best legal principles of the age. In letter, it was as good as any other constitution, as any constitution the state had ever had, or as most American states had at the time. This assertion is supported by the practical endorsement which a subsequent generation of South Carolinians gave it. The conservative whites were content to live under it for 18 years after they recovered control of the state government. And when in 1895, they met to make a new constitution, the document they produced had many of the features of the Constitution of 1868. So if these Black controlled or Black dominated legislatures, as the newspapers or the Democrats would like to say, were so awful and so terrible, how did they create these institutions that lasted for decades? And but for the Redeemer governments at the end of the 19th century, who came in and built constitutions to support white supremacy, they might well be in place today. Okay, so let me talk about some of these interesting folks. I included Freedom Road. So Howard Fast historical fiction on the reading list. And if anybody is interested, I can talk to you more about that. But Eric Foner does a introduction. Du Bois does a foreword to the book. Time won't allow me to talk about the story. It's a phenomenal story. But Francis Cardozo is actually one of the real characters written about in the book. A freeborn Negro, combination Jewish and Indian descent, educated at the University of Glasgow and in London, went on to New Haven, where he served as a Presbyterian minister. After the war, he comes to Charleston and principals the Avery Institute. As I think was mentioned in the film, was the Secretary of State, was a treasurer. Du Bois describes him as handsome, well-groomed, and with a cultivated manner, and an honest official. He was accused in several instances, but no honest act was ever proven against him. Again, the beauty of what Du Bois does in Black Reconstruction is to detail the lives of these individuals, more so than any of the Dunning School people would do. Because remember, the strategy of the Dunnites and the folks who would support Lost Cause with their scholarship was to absolutely discount that any of these Black elected officials had any value, contributed anything of any worth. Du Bois obviously takes great pains to give the names, numbers, dates, and places, which is why his book is so important. Joseph Rainey, born in Georgetown to enslaved parents, 1832. In December 1870, he becomes the first African-American to serve in the U.S. House and only the second to serve in Congress after Hiram Revels. He was elected 4 times as a Republican, serving until March 1879. Let me talk about Robert Brown Douglas here. I think I've got an image of him. Born in 1842 in Liverpool, England, he attended High Holborn Academy in London, then studied law, graduating from Eton College in 1859. He served in the British Royal Navy, settled in South Carolina in 1867, and was admitted to practice in 1868. He worked for Richard H. Kane, another South Carolina congressman, also mentioned in the video clip, and was elected a delegate to the 1868 convention, the famous 1868 convention we've been talking about. Because of his military experience, he was appointed Assistant Adjutant General for South Carolina, becoming the first African-American commanding general in the South Carolina National Guard. The state militia, by the way, charged with fighting the Ku Klux Klan. Eliot was elected to Congress in 1870, ran unsuccessfully for the Senate in 1872, won a seat in the South Carolina General Assembly in 1874, where he was elected Speaker of the General Assembly in 1875. His last elective position was as South Carolina Attorney General in 1876. In 1879, he accepts an appointment as a Special Customs Inspector for the Treasury Department, and tragically will die of malaria in 1884 at the age of 41, having relocated to New Orleans to continue the practice of law. Du Bois mentions in his writing on Eliot that he was viewed by everyone as a potentially huge figure of our people for years to come. And here this brilliant Brit dies tragically. All right, okay, and we're gonna come back to Eliot in a moment, but let me a couple of more comments. The video mentioned Robert DeLarge. He was a tailor from Charleston and an agent for the Freedmen's Bureau. Rancière, also mentioned in the video, a freeborn Black, elected a lieutenant governor in 1870, a member of the 1868 convention, member of the state legislature, and an auditor of Charleston County. And then Robert Smalls, of course, we know a great deal about. Let me set up this, another of these Currier and Ives images that I love. I didn't go through the trouble of reading all of the underlined text. I've forwarded this to anybody and send you a link if you'd like to, but it's here because it is done to depict the battle. And this is later. This is the argument in Congress over passage of the 1875 Civil Rights Act. And Alexander Stephens, on behalf of the opposition, the Democrats, will speak first. And Stephens is aged and ill. He is walking on a cane. He is escorted to the well of the house by his black attendant, and leaning on that cane, he speaks for most of the afternoon. Eliot is scheduled to speak after him, but it's late. Everyone, Stephens has worn out the room. And the Speaker of the House, obviously a Republican and a supporter of Eliot's, decides, no, we're not going to go into the evening. We're going to do this in the morning. Eliot can come in and make his speech in the morning. And the Speaker also knew that that would give the Republicans time to get the word out. Robert B. Eliot is going to meet Alexander Stephens, former Vice President of the Confederacy, on the floor of the House. And so by morning, the House chamber is overrun. The gallery is filled with black and white people. The press are filling all of the available press room, and Eliot begins his address. So this is January 6, 1874. His argument, and I'm only going to read you portions of this. It's brilliant, in support of the Civil Rights Act, which will become the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Eliot continues. He says, in this discussion, I cannot and I will not forget that the welfare and rights of my whole race in this country are involved. When, therefore, the honorable gentleman from Georgia, Stephens, lends his voice and influence to defeat this measure, I do not shrink from saying that it is not from him that the American House of Representatives should take lessons in matters touching human rights or the joint relations of the state and national governments. While the honorable gentleman contented himself with harmless speculations in his study or in the columns of a newspaper, we might well smile at the impotence of his efforts to turn back the advancing tide of opinion and progress. But when he comes again upon this national arena and throws himself with all his power and influence across the path which leads to the full enfranchisement of my race, I meet him only as an adversary. Nor shall age or any other consideration restrain me from saying that he now offers this government, which he has done his utmost to destroy, a very poor return for its magnanimous treatment. To come here and seek to continue by the assertion of doctrines obnoxious to the true principles of our government, the burdens and oppressions which rest upon 5 millions of his countrymen who never fail to lift their earnest prayers for success of this government, when the gentleman was seeking to break up the union of these states and to blot the American Republic from the galaxy of nations. Eliot goes on, Sir, it is scarcely 12 years since the gentleman shocked the civilized world by announcing the birth of a government which rested on human slavery as its cornerstone. The progress of events has swept away the pseudo-government which rested on greed, pride, and tyranny. And the race whom he then ruthlessly spurned and trampled on are here to meet him in debate and to demand that the rights which are enjoyed by their former oppressors, who vainly sought to overthrow a government which they could not prostitute to the base uses of slavery, shall be accorded to those who even in the darkness of slavery kept their allegiance true to freedom and the Union. Imagine, if you can, this young upstart, brilliant black man facing this house, and I just owe it to have been present. It would have been a wonder. Let me move on. Mississippi. So South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana would be the reconstructed Republican states with the largest black populations. This will give you just some sense of between 1800 to 1860. Obviously, that large increase in the number of black folks were enslaved people moved from the Mid-South to the Lower South to feed the cotton engine. And we talk a lot about that in my slavery class, but that would account for that large change. As we said in South Carolina, under presidential Reconstruction, Johnson had his people in place, and they immediately began to try to return that state back to slavery with the passage of the Black Codes. Reconstruction government comes in, and things change. Obviously, the Black folks who are now voting, repeal the Black Codes, and the new Constitution they passed would do away with property qualifications for office or suffrage. It forbade slavery. It provided for mixed public schools. This is Mississippi now we're talking about. It forbade race distinctions in possession and inheritance of property. It prohibited the abridgment of civil rights in travel. I haven't made the point enough that in each of these constitutions, there were civil rights provisions, the right to travel, the right to accommodate, to be accommodated, the right to be educated. These gentlemen understood the opportunity in being involved in this process. Let me look at some. We've talked about, a lot about Hiram Revels. Came from North Carolina, educated in Indiana. He was a minister in Baltimore at the opening of the war, and there he helped to organize 2 U.S. colored troop regiments. He goes to the South with the Freedmen's Bureau, and is surprised, frankly, that he's so well received by the Black community there, being not a lifelong resident, but he's elected to the state senate, and he's obviously an intelligent man. When he is elected to the U.S. Senate, it takes the Senate 3 days to argue over his admission. As you know, both the House and the Senate have rules, and they can determine who is seated even if they're elected by their state or their district. Charles Sumner, in one of his ablest speeches, comes to the rescue, and he is seated and completes the unexpired term of Jefferson Davis. Again, another of the great ironies. Blanche K. Bruce, we've seen his image, born Branch Bruce, the enslaved son of Polly Bruce and his enslaver Pettus Perkinson. He escapes to Lawrence, Kansas in 1963, works as a teacher. After the war, he attends Oberlin College, but can't complete his studies because of the lack of resources. Makes his way to Mississippi working on a riverboat, settles in a very heavily Black, heavily Republican county, and wins in quick order elections to be sheriff, tax collector, superintendent of education. All the while, he's editing a newspaper and building some wealth. February of 1874, he is chosen by the state legislature to serve in the Senate, and he would be the first African American to serve a full term. I think I'm going to move on because I'm running out of time. Okay, I do want to talk about John Lynch, but before I do that, Marion, Lois, Linda, any questions? Let's take an earlier break than I had scheduled.
I don't have questions, but I do have a couple of statements.
Okay.
One is from Jim Stewart, who said, "Let's also pay our respects to Reverend C.T. Vivian, who passed away this week."
Thank you, Jim. That was on my plan. So thank you for yes, another titan of the civil rights era, a close associate of Dr. King, and again, we lost another hero. Thank you, Jim.
And then Doris Johnson mentioned Rust College, Holly Springs, Mississippi, was also founded in 1866 her alma mater.
Thank you. Yours. All right. I've talked quite a bit, obviously, about Eliot, but let me talk about John Roy Lynch, John R. Lynch, another interesting legislator, again, hero of the age. Congressman, soldier, author, born in Concordia, Paris, Louisiana in 1874, to Patrick Lynch, an Irish immigrant, and Catherine White, his slave. Lynch's father dies shortly after birth, and he and his mother are traded to Natchez, Mississippi. If you know the history of Natchez, it was, I don't know if they bought and sold more enslaved people than in Charleston, but Natchez was for a period both the center of the slave trade and the center of the most wealthy Americans in the world for the period before the war. During the war, Lynch frees himself and becomes a cook for the 49th Illinois Volunteer Regiment. During Reconstruction, he joins the Republican Party in Mississippi, and after working as secretary, becomes a justice of the peace in Natchez County, Mississippi. November 1869, at the age of 22, he's elected to the Mississippi House of Representatives. 3 years later, he's named Speaker of the House. In 1872, he will run for the Senate seat, a House seat in the House of Representatives. He's elected, winning more than 50% of the popular vote. And in the Congress, he's known mostly for his support of civil rights and bills like the Civil Rights Act of 1875. During his congressional campaign of 1874, Lynch voices concerns against the racist white attacks on Black Republicans in Mississippi, and this would be a prelude to the bloody Mississippi gubernatorial campaign of 1875, where hundreds of Blacks and white Republicans were killed. Despite these violent tactics, which reduced the Republican vote in the state, Lynch managed to be reelected to Congress in 1874 and 1876. I think it was David Blight or Fonner who made the point that, and I think the percentage he gave was 10% of all Black elected officials during Reconstruction were murdered. And many more of them were attacked and wounded in the process of running for office, of moving about the district. So the courage, obviously, that it would take for these to do what they do is amazing. During his third term, he is increasingly isolated from the other politicians. Obviously, by this late in Reconstruction, the number of Black compatriots have fallen off. So he's dealing mostly with Democrats. Despite that intense opposition, he's reelected again in 1880, the very end, beyond Reconstruction. Because the Democrats disputed his election, he fights for over a year, half of his term, before he's finally seated. During his remaining year in Congress, he continues to wage battles for civil rights. Lynch will be defeated for reelection in 1882 by a Natchez County judge, and then he'll run unsuccessfully again in 84 and 86. In 84, he's nominated to an honorific position as temporary chair of the Republican National Convention, held that year in Chicago. This is 1884. That same year, he'll marry a woman, Ella Somerville, and they'd have a daughter. 1897, he'll pass the Mississippi bar and open a law office in Washington. In 1898, President McKinley will appoint him a major in the U.S. Army and a paymaster for the volunteers during the Spanish-American War. He'll divorce his wife, serve in Cuba for 3 years, and later the Philippines and Hawaii. He'll retire from active duty in 1911, returning to Natchez, where he'll marry again a woman named Cora Williamson, and they'll relocate to Chicago. So although Lynch will practice law periodically in Chicago, he's increasingly concerned about the negative and inaccurate portrayals of Blacks in Reconstruction being generated by white scholars. he becomes an author and historian to set the record straight. Lynch wrote The Facts of Reconstruction, published in 1913. Du Bois's Black Reconstructions, published in, I believe, 1943. I have to check that, but obviously, so this is 1913. He followed his book with articles in the Journal of Negro History, now the Journal of African American History, Journal of the Association for the Study of African American History and Life. Between 1917 and 18, he's writing articles. And in 1922, he began writing Reminiscence of an Active Life, the autobiography of John R. Lynch. While editing his autobiography, Lynch, the last surviving Black congressman in the Reconstruction era, died in Chicago November 2nd, 1939, at the age of 92. His book was published posthumously in 1970. So imagine, not only does he live a life that takes your breath away when you think about what he accomplished in the face of ever constant threat and opposition, he'll go on then to recognize early in the 20th century that this lost cause movement and scholars supportive of it are distorting what he knows to be the facts. So he writes his own early version. I have not read his book on Reconstruction, but I'm going to have to add it. The Facts of Reconstruction, 1930. Add it to my library. Pretty remarkable. Okay, we've had a question session. I'm going to keep moving here since we've got about half an hour left. Marion, unless anybody's got a pressing question for me.
There is one question. Was Blanche K. Bruce also the first Black in the U.S. House, or was that someone else? This is from Sandy Armstrong.
I think Bruce was the second Black in the U.S. Senate. I'd have to go back, but I think that's what I said. Hiram Revels preceded him, but Revels only completed the unexpired term of Jefferson Davis. I have to go back and see if Blanche Bruce was ever a congressman. Again, he's known as the first full-term senator. I hope that answers the question, and I hope it's accurate. I know Jim or somebody else will correct me if it's not. I've passed over my notes now. Let's talk a bit about the other states, and then I want to get into the end of talking about the violence and backlash. Louisiana, like South Carolina, like Mississippi, you see the demographics and why Louisiana is so important. Like the others, during presidential Reconstruction, you have a racist governor put in place and Black codes are passed. And then you have the Reconstruction Act, where you see the large number of Black people registering and voting, which then accounts for the changes that they will make in that process. And some of the key players there, PBS Pinchback, I'll just pick him out. I don't have time to go through all of these, but I love the name, PBS Pinchback. Son of a white man and himself indistinguishable from white in personal appearance, was born in Georgia, educated in Cincinnati, and had been a captain in the Army. He was intelligent and capable, but a leader of different caliber than Oscar Dunn. And these are comments taken from Du Bois. He was a practical politician and played the politician's game. Yet here were limits beyond which he would not go. To all intents and purposes, he was an educated, well-to-do, congenial white man with but a few drops of Negro blood, which he did not stoop to deny, as so many of his fellows did. Pinchback succeeded Dunn as lieutenant governor, and when Warmoth, the governor, was impeached, Pinchback became for a few days governor of the state. I mention him particularly because I'm taken back to our Reconstruction class, and I had images of most of these politicians when we were doing this at Ollie. And one of the students raised his hand and said, "That's not a Black man." And as we then launch into this discussion of the one drop rule. And for those of you who don't know, in the South, throughout this period, long before this period, this question of who's Black, who's white had great significance. And in the minds of the enslavers, one drop of Black blood made you Black. And what Du Bois makes the point here that Pinchback had such integrity that he chose to align himself, to identify himself as Black, and was elected and ran and worked as a Black man. Not enough time to talk about colorism that was at play, but just recognize that it was in fact real. Alabama, again, there's a host of heroes here we could talk about. Let's see what Du Bois had to say about this group. He said 12 of these men were the earliest to enter Congress. Who were the earliest to enter Congress were ex-slaves or born of slave parents and brought up when Negroes were denied education. On the other hand, the other 4 had received a more or less complete college education in the North and abroad. 5 of the congressmen were lawyers, and 2, Elliott and Rapier, had unusual training and ability. The 12, he's not obviously talking about the number on this slide, but the group. And he's got some data on the backgrounds, again, of all of these people. All right, so I'm now going to transition, and again, I love this image, the broken chain, and he's obviously holding up some version of a state constitution declaring, I'm a free man, I'm going to be free, notwithstanding the efforts placed against me. I will provide this. It's a handy sort of guide to Black office holders in the South, and it comes from, again, our Facing Our History and Ourselves segment. And it just, if you're just interested in seeing some of this first table, Black office holders during Reconstruction. So the total number, Fonner said there were 1,500 to 2,000. So that additional 400 some are probably the local postmasters, sheriffs that never get captured. But I love going through the chart because it tells you sort of the story of what was going on. Black members of Congress during Reconstruction by state, Black office holders during Reconstruction, state and major Black state officials, Pinch in Louisiana. So I'll send you this in our follow-up, just if you're interested to just scroll through and see some of the different offices. Okay, let me get back here, and I think, all right, so in wrapping up, experiments in interracial democracy. I said last week when I found Lerone Bennett Jr.'s Black Power USA, his Reconstruction piece, really embraced the concept. He's obviously writing in the middle of the 20th century with a different Black Power construct, but there's no comparison, obviously, to the era we're talking about during Reconstruction and the number of Black people voting in the face of just extraordinary opposition, but voting and building community, building schools and institutions. The South was unwilling to change, as we've said all along, and we know that the oligarchs, the wealthy, the planters, are plotting and planning the retaking of the land, because again, that land was their life, and the Northern industrialists were going to support that because they wanted that wealth back at play as well. So there's lots of change obviously taking place in this post-war era that will continue into the 20th century. But it is change that will result in the loss of rights and liberty and freedom for Black men, women, and children. Let's start this segment with a video, and we'll conclude next week talking about the several incidents, two in particular that I think are particularly important. Violence and backlash.
There is, in American history, throughout American history, a long and rich tradition of backlash against social progress, and particularly racial progress. And so Reconstruction places this into violent relief, because it was really, at that point in American history, the first time where you saw a kind of revolutionary possibility for racial progress.
But like in everyone's history, whenever there's a revolution, there's always a counter-revolution. Terror, which we hear so much about in the world today, this was homegrown terror in the United States, born of defeat, born of loss, born of this ex-Confederate rage at their condition, their situation, believing as they did that the damn Yankees and the Union government and the federal government had come into the South, taken over their society, freed all these former slaves, put them in political office, allowed them to vote, and they had come to believe that there was no point in participating in this political process. It was not their democracy. And they believed the only way to react to it was with guns and violence to destroy it.
I think the violence that you see during Reconstruction is certainly connected to an idea that the United States and the South in particular is exclusively for white people. That black people do not have a place in this country unless it's on terms of absolute subservience. But I do think you see the violence manifested in different ways for different purposes.
The violence in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War is the violence of a social system that has collapsed, and no one knows what the new etiquette is going to be. Everyone knew how a slave was supposed to behave, but nobody knew how a former slave was supposed to behave. Violence flares over what seemed to us completely trivial things. A guy doesn't tip his hat. A black guy doesn't tip his hat to a white on the streets, and suddenly people are shooting at each other. A black guy walks into a church trying to worship, and suddenly people are being killed.
At the same time, you do see other incidents of violence, race riots in New Orleans, in Memphis, that speak to more organized forms of resistance.
Then when blacks get the right to vote, violence becomes more and more political. By 1867-68, you get already the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Klan is not a highly centralized organization. It doesn't have a president. It's local groups all around the southern states. And even though they are localized, they have the same basic aim, which is to restore white supremacy.
Their primary goal was political. Their primary goal was to stop black politics, to destroy the Republican Party, and particularly to stop black people from voting.
White terror became a fact of life. White mobs could come and burn their houses, could rape women, could lynch men, could brutalize and terrorize people.
no one was immune from it. Men, women, children, the most respectable African Americans. That was not an inhibitor to having incredibly, at times, spectacular forms of violence being inflicted on you. This really spoke to how invested many white Southerners were in a way of life prior to the destruction of slavery that rendered black people as less than human. And one of the ways to hold on to that idea was through the violent dehumanization of black people, of black bodies.
Early Klan violence, though, was committed against as many white Republicans as it was black Republicans. If you were a white Republican, a so-called scalawag, or a white unionist in a certain region of the South, and you joined the Republican Party, you were vulnerable. It becomes very dangerous in some places to be a Republican official. Local leaders are assassinated or driven from their homes or beaten.
These are nighttime lynchings, burnings, murderings, stabbings, beatings, really, really violent stuff. And in 1868, they kill about 1,000 people before the election.
In 1868, Klan violence is so pervasive in Georgia that actually the Republicans lose the state to the Democrats because black people are just too intimidated to come and vote.
If you think about this being a war in which there were no militarily related hangings for treason or anything, it's not like people didn't die during Reconstruction. It just wasn't the people who had started the war. It was people who were trying to heal the country.
1 of every 10 black members of these constitutional writing conventions for the new reconstructed governments in the South, and there were dozens and dozens of blacks that participated. 1 of every 10 of them was either murdered or wounded by vigilante violence. You risked your life by even participating in this new Reconstruction political process.
Klan is very active 1869, 70, and then by 1871, President Grant, using these enforcement acts which are passed by Congress, sends troops into parts of South Carolina. He sends federal marshals to Alabama and other places. They round up Klansmen, they put them on trial.
They even held what became known as the Ku Klux Klan hearings. And they would allow victims of Klan violence to come in and testify about what had happened to them. And they even allowed perpetrators to come in and testify in their own defense. Nothing like this had ever occurred in American history. Congressionally sponsored hearings to investigate social and political violence within the states. Courts only prosecuted a handful of people. And all of that violence in the South, several thousand people killed in this violence, untold others wounded, intimidated, abused. No one served more than 5 years for any Klan crime, and all of them were free and out by 1876.
But they actually do break the back of the Klan, and by 1872, violence is much less pervasive in the South. In 1873, the country and the Western world enters a serious economic depression, the Depression of 1873 to 78. And in a way, that pushes the Reconstruction issue off the political agenda. The agenda is now labor, capital, employment, unemployment, labor strife. Very violent strikes begin to take place. Secondly, in 1874, because of the economic downturn, the Democrats, for the first time since the Civil War, win control of the House of Representatives. And therefore, there's not going to be any more federal intervention because the Congress can no longer be relied on to engage in that. And so by 1874, 75, 76, you get a different kind of violence. It's open. The Klan went around in, hoods and costumes, even though people knew who they were, but they were, in disguise. Now you get open violence where people are in your face with it. And the aim is explicitly about elections. To win elections which will enable them to take over the state governments in these places.
If one person were shot today at a voting poll, probably stop the election in that town. CNN would have a helicopter there, filming everything. You have to try to imagine, 40 people murdered near a voting poll, 60 people murdered near a voting poll. Massacres committed to intimidate a community to make sure they didn't try to vote.
In Colfax, Louisiana, in 1873, blacks and some whites joined together to elect a slate of candidates, and white vigilantes came and killed 100 people in order to overturn that election. And the Supreme Court said that there had been no civil rights violation there, that this was simply one group of private citizens acting with another.
It's the largest political massacre in all of American history. And it needs to be seen for what it was. Terror being used as a kind of politics, as a way of intimidating somebody, as a way of thwarting, their aspirations on any level.
One of the effects that the incredible violence in the South did was exhaust the will of the North and of the federal government to continue investing in Reconstruction, to continue investing in the protection of black people.
It's people saying, look, we gave black people their freedom, we gave them the right to vote, we crushed the South, we're tired of it. Enough already. Get over it. The problem of Reconstruction is over. It's not our problem anymore.
Before the election of 1876, when Democrats are trying to take back over the rest of the southern states and to be in control of the South once and for all, they do things like hold gun rallies outside of Republican political meetings. They wear certain clothing. They identify themselves in South Carolina, for example, by wearing red shirts. They make it clear that it would not be good for your health to be voting for Republicans.
Those terror groups tended to now be a kind of an unofficial wing of the Southern Democratic Party, without a question. They were one and the same often. They even responded to Southern governors.
I think all of us love the idea that we might be the ones out there insisting on voting, and I wish we all were. But if it were a question of making sure that your kids were going to eat the next day or casting a vote, a lot of people decided that discretion was the better part of valor and didn't show up to vote.
And that election, of course, turns into a dispute because no one won the Electoral College on the first count, and they have to go through this beleaguered, corrupt count, out of which came a compromise that made Rutherford B. Hayes president and gave the last remaining southern states back to the Democratic Party. And in effect, sacrificed the rights of the freed people to the southern states themselves for a long time to come.
So what this meant was that the freedoms that initially put black men and women into the state legislature, into the Congress, enable them to vote, enable them to serve on juries, enable them to own businesses, were undermined by vigilante violence, by new laws that were passed to constrain them. But I think of the dividing of blacks and whites in a way differently, I think, from a lot of people. If you have to use the Klan, if you have to use state militias, if you have to murder 100 black people in Colfax, Louisiana to prevent blacks and whites to work together, it means you have to exert enormous force, because otherwise it would have been okay, because people wanted to do it. In other words, the degree of brutality and repression was only because the strength of that democracy was so great. If you didn't use force against it, it wouldn't have died. And that indicates to me that there was always a chance to restore those relations.
Professor Lipsett's last comment about the strength of the democracy, I haven't found a better characterization or description of the point he makes than I find in Howard Fast, Freedom Road. Again, so I commend that to any of you to read. It is written in the 40s, written in vernacular. Prepare yourself for that, but it captures so powerfully. We're going to talk next week about the Force Acts, Colfax, Coushatta, Hamburg, about the end of Reconstruction. Nobody has captured or summarized this better than Foner, as you're not surprised to hear. So let me just read to you as he ends the era of active black political activity and moves to this darker era as the white South reasserts itself. Foner says, in 1872, newspapers recorded the passing of Maurice Jasper, the last surviving slave of George Washington. Born of parents brought from Africa over a century before, Jasper had lived the new national era, commented, to see the Second Revolution. He died at a time of stocktaking, North and South, as the first period of Republican Reconstruction drew to a close. In political, economic, and social life, these years presented a complex pattern of achievement and disappointment. Compared with their predecessors, the accomplishments of the new governments were indeed impressive. Biracial democratic government, a thing unknown in American history, was functioning effectively in many parts of the South. Men only recently released from bondage cast ballots and sat on juries, and in the Deep South enjoyed an increasing share of authority at the state level. While the conservative oligarchy that had dominated Southern government from colonial times to 1867 found itself largely excluded from power. Public facilities had been rebuilt and expanded, school systems established, and tax codes modernized. Occurring at a crucial juncture in the transition from slavery to freedom, Reconstruction had nipped in the bud the attempt to substitute a legalized system of labor discipline for the coercion of slavery, and enhanced blacks' bargaining power on the plantations. All in all, Foner said, declared a white South Carolina lawyer in 1871, we have gone through one of the most remarkable changes in relations to each other that has been known perhaps in the history of the world. Foner goes on, most strikingly of all perhaps was the impact upon the freedmen, for Reconstruction transformed their lives and aspirations in ways unmeasurable by statistics and in realms far beyond the reach of the law. A Northern correspondent reporting from Vicksburg early in 1873 captured something of the change in blacks' conception of themselves. One hardly realizes the fact that many Negroes one sees here have been slaves a few short years ago, at least as far as their demeanor goes as individuals newly invested with all the rights and privileges of an American citizen. They appreciate their new condition thoroughly and flaunt their independence. In many ways, of course, the second revolution was woefully incomplete. Republicans had undertaken to promote political equality in a society characterized by equality and nothing else. Blacks still suffered from dire poverty, and the old ruling class remained largely intact, implacably hostile to the new order of things. But as long as Reconstruction survived, so too did the possibility of further change. Nothing renders society more restless, Carl Schurz had written in 1865, than a revolution but half accomplished. If Reconstruction's failures betrayed the utopian aspirations with which Republican rule began, its successes persuaded those accustomed to controlling the South's destiny that the entire experiment must be overturned. While Republican leaders struggled to consolidate a party and government plagued by factionalism, racism, and corruption, develop a program capable of capturing white support while serving the needs of the freedmen, and establish themselves as a permanent fixture on the South's political landscape, their opponents were organizing to bring Reconstruction to a violent and irrevocable end. So we again head toward a end to this experiment in American democracy. We'll spend next week looking at the massacres, and I will not call any of these race riots. That is a scandal as we look at terrorism and we look at the violence imposed upon Black men, women, and children. These were massacres. Let me remind you, as I did in my last note, that we extend our summer lecture series to include Dr. Randall Morgan's presentation on race science and medicine in the Reconstruction era, August 1st. So watch for more information about. I'll get a syllabus, Dr. Randall and I'll get a syllabus out to you sometime in the week before that. And that concludes our session for today. Marion, Lois, Linda, do you have any questions?
Yes. We have.
Go ahead, Marion.
I'm sorry. We have a statement from the Cunninghams. One of my ancestors was killed for voting in Louisiana. I made a statement. My mother was beaten in public with a belt for trying to vote in 1964 in Greenville, Mississippi. And then Bob and Carol, the irony of the Republican Party today. I'm sorry?
That was your mother.
My grandmother.
Your grandmother, yeah.
My grandmother. The irony of the Republican Party today, and what is the series that violence and backlash comes from?
It is the series that we've used throughout, Facing History and Ourselves. And I'll send a link again, each of the videos, except the short clips from Henry Louis Gates's PBS, all come from the website, the resource Facing Our History and Ourselves.
And there's a question, is the election of Trump, is that backlash?
Yeah, I think you could argue, and we had that discussion in a phone call discussion yesterday, backlash to the election, the 2 terms of Barack Obama. As David Blight says, revolution is followed by counter-revolution. And I think political scientists and historians have observed that Trump is, in his approach, in his birtherism appeal, made a case against Obama's policies, Obama's person, and appealed to a large enough population of Americans to not win the popular vote, but win the Electoral College. And we are living with him today. Marion, anything else?
Nothing else.
Okay, why don't we, I do want Ray to, I'm going to stop the video here, if I can.
And if everyone could stay muted except for